What if everything you've been taught about the stability of great powers is wrong? What if empires don't fall in sudden catastrophe, but collapse in slow, predictable stages? What if the decline of a world power doesn't begin with defeat on the battlefield, but with policy decisions, internal division, and a false sense of invincibility? And most importantly, what if the United States, right now, is deep into phase 3 of this collapse cycle, with signs hiding in plain sight? This isn't just speculation. Historians, economists, and military analysts alike have studied the life cycle of empires for centuries. From ancient Rome to Imperial China, the British Empire, to the Soviets, a disturbing pattern repeats. The life cycle of empires follows 5 phases: origins, rise, breaking point, fallout, and failed fixes. The language, the technologies, and the time periods may differ, but the underlying trajectory remains eerily consistent. Today, we're going to walk through that cycle. We'll explore each phase, decode what triggers the next, and ask the question: where is America in that cycle now? By the end of this video, you'll see the signs for yourself, and you may not like the answers. To understand where an empire stands today, you have to go back to its roots. The origin of an empire is never labeled the beginning of greatness. It's usually messy, decentralized, and reactive. For Rome, it began as a small republic defending itself against hostile neighbors. For the British, it started with merchant trading outposts. For the United States, it began as a fragile federation of 13 colonies clinging to independence through revolution and war. What binds these origin stories isn't power, it's adversity. Empires are born from necessity. They unite to survive. The military becomes organized. A financial system emerges, and leadership becomes centralized, not out of greed, but out of efficiency. This is phase 1, the origin. Then comes phase 2, the rise. This is the golden age, the period people often look back on with nostalgia. It's marked by expansion, economic, territorial, and technological. Wealth pours in. Infrastructure grows. Military strength becomes unquestionable. For Rome, this was the era of Augustus and Pax Romana. For the British, it was the Industrial Revolution and colonial dominance. For America, it was the post-World War II boom, the Bretton Woods system, the Marshall Plan, the birth of global consumerism, and a booming middle class. Confidence grows. Standards of living rise. Institutions stabilize. The world looks to the empire for leadership. But here's where the first cracks begin to form. Cracks that few recognize in real time. Enter phase 3, the breaking point. This is not a moment. It's a slow motion shift. What changes? What? 3 key things. The cost of maintaining dominance, internal division, and institutional decay. Let's take the United States. After the Cold War, the US found itself as the sole superpower. It expanded its military footprint to over 750 bases in 80 countries. It took on the role of global policeman, from the Balkans to the Middle East. But that dominance came at a cost. Trillions in military expenditures, unsustainable debt, and a growing dependence on financial instruments rather than industrial productivity. Meanwhile, internally, the divisions deepened. Polarization reached historic levels. The middle class, once the backbone of the economy, began to shrink. Wages stagnated. Education costs soared. Infrastructure aged. Faith in institutions, Congress, the media, the justice system plummeted. And then, the money. Empires don't collapse when the enemy is at the gates. They collapse when the financial system becomes a house of cards. Historian Ray Dalio, in his study of long-term debt cycles, notes that every great empire has relied on a dominant currency, until it overspent and overleveraged. For the US, that's the dollar. The Federal Reserve's policies since the 2008 financial crisis, and accelerated during COVID, pushed the national debt past 33 trillion. Trillions were injected into the economy. Yet productivity didn't rise in lockstep. Instead, asset bubbles formed. The wealth gap widened. And inflation, a word America had forgotten, returned. This is phase 3, the beginning of decline masked as growth. Then comes phase 4, the fallout. This is where consequences start to show. Trust begins to erode between citizens and government, between nations and the empire. Foreign allies begin to hedge. New powers emerge, old powers assert themselves. Trade agreements shift away from the dominant empire. Sound familiar? China now leads in critical mineral refining, dominates global supply chains, and advances aggressively in AI and military tech. BRICS nations are developing alternatives to the dollar for international trade. Saudi Arabia, once the keystone of the petrodollar system, has signed agreements with China and Russia. The EU is questioning its reliance on American policy. Even American corporations are seeking offshoring solutions to hedge against domestic instability. Meanwhile, at home, the effects multiply. Rising populism, distrust in elections, riots, and political violence. Rome faced this with civil wars. Britain faced it with anti-colonial revolts and economic depression. The US now faces it in the form of contested narratives, hyper-partisan media, and a public that increasingly lives in parallel realities. But the empire doesn't give up easily. That leads us to phase 5, the failed fixes. At this point, the ruling class recognizes something is wrong, but they misunderstand the root causes. Instead of structural reforms, they turn to short-term patches. In Rome, it was debasement of the currency and military overreach. In Britain, it was borrowing to maintain colonies and delaying industrial modernization. In the US, we see a mix of both. Monetary policy remains the primary tool. More debt, more quantitative easing, more stimulus. But instead of investment in infrastructure or productivity, the money fuels speculation, consumer spending, and temporary relief. Socially, leaders toggle between appeasement and crackdown. Legislation swings wildly. Promises are made but rarely fulfilled. Each administration tries to undo the last. Meanwhile, real problems, like declining life expectancy, deteriorating public education, and decaying urban infrastructure, remain unresolved. The public becomes cynical. Some demand a return to tradition. Others demand a total reset. Neither side believes the system works. And into that vacuum comes collapse. Not a fiery Hollywood-style destruction, but a loss of coherence. The empire still exists, but it no longer leads. It no longer innovates. It no longer inspires. It simply exists. Now let's talk about modern parallels. The US national debt is now over 120% of GDP, a level not seen since World War II. Over 60% of Americans now live paycheck to paycheck. 70% of young Americans are unfit for military service due to obesity, criminal records, or education levels. Life expectancy in the US has declined for 3 consecutive years, an unheard of trend in developed nations. A Gallup poll showed only 7% of Americans have great confidence in Congress. These are not random data points. They are symptoms of a system in phase 3, teetering toward phase 4. And remember, empires don't realize they've declined until long after the fact. So where does this leave us? Here are 3 clear takeaways. First, the life cycle of empires is real. It's not myth. The pattern has repeated across civilizations. And it's measurable through debt, trust, productivity, and global influence. Second, the United States is not immune. Its military, economy, and culture remain dominant, but dominance and resilience are not the same. Indicators across multiple dimensions suggest the US is at least deep into phase 3, if not brushing phase 4. Third, collapse is not inevitable. Decline, yes, but not necessarily collapse. Some empires reform, decentralize, and re-emerge in a new form, but it requires hard choices, long-term thinking, and humility. History suggests most don't succeed, but some do. So here's the final thought. If America is in phase 3, then the decisions made in the next 5 to 10 years are critical. Not for preserving an old empire, but for defining what comes next. Will we double down on denial and short-term fixes, or confront the uncomfortable truths before they confront us? The future doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives slowly, then suddenly. If you found this video insightful, give us a like. It helps our small channel a lot. Subscribe for more videos where history, politics, and economics collide. Because the past doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And if we're not listening, we won't hear the warning bell until it's too late.